Raymond Ibrahim. And Raymond, you are a prolific author. Books and books. The big ones are Sword and Scimitar, Christian Heroes, et cetera, et cetera. True expert on Islam. And so I wanted to kind of talk to you for a long time. I think I've referenced your work numerous times over the years. But anyways, pleasure to have you here. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me, Jeff. Happy to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So let's just go historical and let's go back to the beginning. Where did Islam come from? Kind of set the stage. How was it birthed?
Sure. Well, of course, there's the hagiographical tradition, which Muslims will tell you, and then there's the bare bone history, which is what I like
There
to
you go.
summarize it,
Yeah.
based on Islamic sources, of course.
Yeah.
So basically, Muhammad bin Abdullah, the Prophet of Islam, was born right around 570 A.D. In Arabia. We're not going to get into his whole life, but he was an orphan raised by his uncle, et cetera, et cetera. Around 610, so when he was 40, he claimed that he was getting messages from an angel, Gabriel, in caves, because apparently he would go to the caves and meditate. And the message, in fact, is where we get the word Quran. Ikra means recite in Arabic, so the Quran's the recital, really.
Yeah.
And of course, and the collation of the Quran, how that came into existence, has its own interesting history. But the long story short, he started preaching kind of a staunch monotheism, and that was a defining characteristic of his message in the context of Arabia, which was of course polytheistic, and it had elements of Judaism, Christianity, and apparently he learned much from Jews and Christians, including Nestorian Christians, etc., which might explain some of his views on Christ's nature, etc. Right, and anyway, the message, it's interesting because the Quran, even till today, Muslim scholars will tell you is really has two portions, and they're not even necessarily, they're not chronologically added together or combined. One was the recitals that he had in Medina, okay, and one was in Mecca. Mecca was the earlier phase when he was basically weak. He was not a military commander. He was just, like I said, he started off as an orphan, became a little rich. He married this rich widow, a merchant, etc. And then his message was actually, this is when you think of the Quran, when they show you good verses or tolerant verses, those were the messages. So he would say, for example, you have your religion, I have my religion, to the polytheists of Arabia.
Yeah.
And there is no coercion in religion.
Yes.
Things like that, which we're very used to hearing from the apologists because they love to cite those.
Yes.
But then, then he ended up migrating the Great Hijra to Medina, and there he became a political leader, not just now some solitary religious voice in the wilderness, as he sort of fashioned himself in the early years. And he was a captain of men, and they went on raids, constant raids against anyone, essentially, who was not part of their team, Muslim. And this included Jews that hosted him initially, and then eventually culminated with the conquest of Mecca. So he came back to Mecca a little about around a decade after he had been pushed out. And he left, it's interesting because he left in 610. That's when he went to Medina, and that's year one of the Islamic calendar, which I always found telling, because so in Islamic history, the first year isn't the birth of Muhammad, it's when Muhammad becomes a political leader. Because before the year 622 is when he went to Medina. 610 is when he got his message. So you would think 610 would be the first, but it's not. It's when he becomes a political leader in 622. And that's where you get now the violent Quran verses. So all of a sudden, what was said in Medina was abrogated, literally, and I'll get into that, by verses that say that Muslims must hate everyone who's not a Muslim. They must wage war on them, and they must subjugate them, kill them, terrorize them. And we can parse through the Quran. There's tons of them. And Muslims early on were like, well, which verse is it? Is it the peaceful verses, the Mecca verses, or the Medina? And that's where they came up with this doctrine. In Arabic, it's called al-nasikh wal-mansukh, which means the abrogated and the abrogator. And it basically means any verse that came later in Muhammad's career abrogates and supersedes the one that came before it, which means the Medina Quran completely oversees or overshadows the Mecca Quran, meaning the violent, intolerant verses.
Yep.
So, for example, verse 9:5 or Surah 9:5 says, "Fight the people of the book," which means Jews and Christians, until they feel themselves humbled and pay jizya with willing submission. And the implication, of course, as in Quran 9:5, is if they don't feel humbled and they don't pay jizya, you kill them. And that's the what's also interesting again when I say the bare bone history of Muhammad is if you look at it, it's I've always enjoyed reading Muslim Arabic written sources because there's a certain honesty to them, and the authors don't seem to understand what can be read between the lines of what they're saying because ultimately trying to present Muhammad in a good way. But it becomes very clear because they'll be explaining how, and once he became this military captain, then he decided, for example, to have tons of wives, more than is even prescribed for his followers, Muslim men, which is 4, and all the women they can basically enslave, which is also in the Quran. They're called that which your right hand possesses. But even his young wife Aisha, there's one point where it's recorded where she says, "It's interesting how your Lord Allah gives you recitations that are always kind of advantageous for you personally." So, and she said that in regards to his saying he can have more wives than other people. So it's very clear, and Europeans, and we can definitely get into that, and early non-Muslims, people like John of Damascus, in their very early writings, just to them, Muhammad was some basically military commander, to euphemize, or basically a caravan raider who came up with this, this idea, who fashioned himself as a religious leader. And in my view, the best way to understand Islam is Muhammad took the social mores of his society, which is tribalism, unadulterated tribalism, and he deified it. So instead of, tribalism is, me and mine against you and yours, and me and mine and everyone else is my enemy. Okay, that's what tribalism is in Arabia, and not just Arabia, but any tribal nation, nomadic societies. Right. He took that idea, but now it was no longer me and my family. It became Muslims. Muslims are the family, and everyone who's not a Muslim, and he even in the Quran says, even if it's your father or mother or your brother, they are the enemy. They're outside of the tribe. And you have these doctrines like the loyalty and enmity, which is all throughout the Quran about hating. You have to not just fight, you have to actually hate and have enmity for non-Muslims in your heart. To the point that an Egyptian cleric, Yasser al-Burhami, I have a video of him which I translated maybe a decade ago. He says, even though it's legitimate and legal for Muslims to marry people of the book, meaning Christian or Jewish women, because of this doctrine, you have to hate them in your heart and show them that you hate them, even while you copulate with them and enjoy them, including monetarily, whatever. You have to make sure you hate them. So I think really, it's the tribalistic aspect that underscores to me the totality of Islamic teaching, especially vis-a-vis the non-Muslim.
Yeah, that's a great thumbnail. We just covered a lot. So let me unpack a couple things with you to understand. And my understanding, and help me out, you're the expert, so he was hearing the voices, and I think he went to his wife, and didn't he say, I'm either losing my mind or I may be possessed. What's going on here? Is that because he's like, I'm hearing these voices? Is that correct?
Yeah, that's based on Islamic sources. At first, he thought it was a genie, or which in modern parlance means demon.
Yes,
because jinn. This entity would come and basically attack him and squeeze him very tightly, and the sources say he would sweat and he would suffer. Modern secular renderings are say that Muhammad was basically an epileptic, and he was having epileptic
I've read
seizures.
that, yeah.
Right. But to the early Christians and other non-Muslims, based on those sources, they believed it was a demon tormenting him. That Gabriel was in fact a jinn, according to the Arabic rendering of demons. And he did tell his wife Khadijah all this, but she very adroitly told him, she said, no, that's the angel. That's an angel, and you need to tell people.
You're a prophet.
So she supported that narrative, even though he himself had serious reservations initially.
Yeah. And then again, my understanding, so then he goes out and starts trying to build a religion peacefully, and he does this for 10 years or so. And how did that work? How did that go?
It didn't go very well at all. He had, after 10 years, he had maybe 100 or a little more followers, and most of them again were relatives and tribal members, so that sort of made sense.
Yeah.
They weren't necessarily convicted. And you know, he preached it peacefully. We have to keep in mind, and this goes back to the idea of capability, which is a massive idea in Islamic teaching, especially in the context of jihad. While jihad, fighting the non-Muslim in order to spread Islamic rule, is incumbent and an obligation, it should only be done when Muslims are in a good position to do it. So if they're weak, they're not supposed to wage a physical jihad. That's when they're supposed to resort to secondary forms of jihad, jihad of the tongue, propaganda, jihad of money, so funding whatever benefits Islam, bribing non-Muslims, et cetera, jihad of the womb. And these are all the sorts of jihads that we're seeing today, though most people are unfamiliar with it. Jihad of the womb being the demographic jihad, having more babies and basically outnumbering infidels. So when Muhammad, in his initial stage, of course, he was very outnumbered and weak, and that's why he was very peaceful. And it was only once he got the capability and he went to Medina and eventually gathered all these different tribes and became a political military commander, that's when the whole story shifted. And so today, according to Islamic teaching, it's not that the Medina verses, the violent ones, the intolerant ones, have completely superseded and abrogated the Meccan verses, but rather Muslims are to incorporate whichever phase they're in. And I have a very telling story. I used to have a Somali friend when I worked at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., and he was a very pious Muslim. And we had these discussions often. And I said what I just told you about this abrogation and different phases. And my point was to say, you know, you're preaching peacefulness, but this is what Islam says. So he just looked at me and shrugged and said, you know, yeah, because I'm living in Mecca.
And he's honest.
About Washington, D.C.
That's right.
Yeah, he was honest. But he said it in a way that no one would understand except me. I mean, it was cryptically said, but he was humorously kind of going along with me. And his point, I'm in Mecca, I'm in America. I'm not gonna, I can't preach the Medina version. Right.
And this
I think that. Go ahead.
Well, it explains so much, and I know, you know, I think probably my most fascinating interview of all time, and his name escapes me. He's in my first book, but this was the gentleman who was the lead radical in Britain who ended up in prison. What's his?
Oh yeah, Anjem Choudhury or
Anjem Choudhury, true radical. But I love this guy. He was honest because he'd say, "Look, most Muslims don't want to tell you the truth because of this dynamic." So he was just bold enough and believed in Islam so much that he would say, "Look, this is what the book teaches." And so their cowardice, you know, they lie with Western audiences because they're cowards and they're not strong enough to say, this is Islam.
And I agree with you about, you know, I find the radical Muslims, I find them refreshing in the sense that they're honest. And ISIS, the Islamic State, you know, for all their disgusting atrocities that they've committed, they wrote a very, I thought, I love citing it, even though it's hidden now by the algorithms, but they wrote a piece called Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You. And it goes out of its way to tell you it's not because of your politics. It's not because you've done anything bad to us. It's not because you support Israel. He said those are all, the article said these are all secondary. They're secondary. And he said the reason we really hate you is because the Quran commands us to hate you. And we have to wage jihad and we have to do that. And he cited it. And so, yeah, those kinds of Muslims are definitely out there and refreshing, like I said, because they actually, the other ones are really more dangerous. The ones who preach moderation because they're basically a fifth column. And the whole purpose is to cause you, you know, not to scrutinize Islam and to get your guard down as they gather strength.
Yes, of course. Yeah. And I'm just going back. Okay, so 10 years, he's back to Muhammad. He's trying peacefully to build his following. It's not really going well. Also, historically, it's interesting and explains a lot what we see in the books later on. There was a fair amount of mocking that's recorded in the books. Talk about that. Who was he being mocked by, and what did that result in?
Yeah, when he was in Mecca, especially, the mockery began. You know, Muhammad thinks he's a prophet. Muhammad thinks God's talking to him, and they would poke at, you know, the holes and the gaps in his, you know, message.
And the contradictions too,
And the contradictions, you know, like I was talking about Aisha, you know, she found every time he seemed to have he would want to do something in which she knew because she's his wife, his favorite wife, supposedly. All of a sudden he would come tell the Muslims, I have a new revelation, one which works directly in advantage of what he wanted to do. So that thing was very obvious to them, but they did mock him a lot. And in fact, the laws, the blasphemy laws, which we see today all around the world, the burnings of Qurans and whatnot, and all the rage that goes on, traces to him. He's the one who first called on his followers to execute and assassinate people who mocked him. And this includes one woman, and because, the Arabian Bedouin society is very given to verse, poetry. And so they would make mocking, doggerel about him. And so he would send assassins, including one woman who they stabbed her while she was, suckling her babe. And an older man, a Jewish man, Ka'b ibn Ashraf, who also famously mocked him. And this anecdote is even more telling because so basically Muhammad put up his hands and screamed and said, "Who's going to kill this man who's an enemy of Allah and his prophet?" Always Allah and his prophet. And one young Muslim volunteered and said, "I'll go assassinate him. But to do so, I have to lie and say I'm not a Muslim, because obviously if he knows I'm a Muslim, he's not going to want anything to do with me. And I have to get into his confidence and good graces." And Muhammad said, "Do it." And the young Muslim went and started telling Ka'b, "Oh, Muhammad's a fool. I agree with you. I was with him. I left him." And slowly they became friends until at one point Ka'b let his guard down and he beheaded him. The young Muslim brought his head to Muhammad and everyone screamed Allahu Akbar. So that sort of thing, when you see it happening today, you have to understand it goes straight back to the source, Muhammad. And the mockery. See, the thing is, this mockery has been with him from the start. There's no other religious leader who had this, and which is why it's so pivotal to silence it. It's also pivotal to silence it because if it goes on without being suppressed, more and more Muslims will sort of agree with it, and they'll break away. The same thing with the apostasy law for Islam. Yusuf al-Qaradawi, the very world famous sheikh before he died recently, said if it wasn't for the apostasy law killing Muslims who try to leave Islam, Islam would have died in its crib. There's definitely a lot of truth to that.
Fascinating.
But one last point about the mockery. All the same fellows who had mocked him in Mecca, when he finally came back, especially the chieftains, when he finally came back a decade later and conquered them, there's even, again, the sources are just just so ingenuous. And they say he went up to one of the leaders who had mocked him for 10 years. And he said, "What do you say now?" I forget his name, Abu Sufyan. He says, "What do you say now, Abu Sufyan? Am I not the prophet?" And Abu Sufyan says, even though he had capitulated, "As to that, I'm not sure." And then one Muslim next to Muhammad says, "Say it now or we'll cut your head off." And then he says, "Yes, you are the prophet of Allah." They all say Allahu Akbar.
There's a doctrine.
So even in the sources, you just see all the doubts and mockery and coercion and do it or we'll kill you.
Yeah. And Raymond, with the mocking too, it was, I mean, if you go back and read it, he wasn't a theological expert, yet he was citing, Judaism and Christianity. And part of that mocking, especially with the Jews, is like, "Oh my gosh, you don't know the scriptures. That's embarrassing." I'm being colloquial, but that's kind of the idea of what's going on. So he had a special enmity, not just for that Jewish man, but for Jews in general. Is that a fair?
Initially, this enmity was not on display for Jews or Christians, and he actually would speak well of them. But then later on, again in the Medina phase, he beheaded a whole tribe of them on some pretext. And then the verses, like you say, the theology is so misrepresented. He says the Jews are condemned in the Quran because they believe in, I forget his name, some historical character, which is the same thing with Christianity. He abjures and condemns the Trinity because he thinks the third person is Mary, the mother of Jesus. So definitely his theology is very shaky. And the sad thing is, despite all the wrong things that the Quran and Islamic history gets about Christianity and Judaism, the Muslim response today is, "No, you guys have it wrong." So it's your Bible, which was written and collated centuries before the Quran, is wrong because the Quran contradicts it. So that's their logic, sadly.
Yeah. And let's just talk about battles and violence. So many people would say, well, there was violence going on, but that was his followers. But I think the books themselves contradict that. How many battles was he involved? How many deaths was he personally responsible for?
Oh, I wrote about this, and I can tell you right now. He was actually involved, or he waged, I can pull it up right here if you want the exact number, but he waged something like 20 battles
28 battles, yeah.
20, yeah, or more, yeah, like more like 30,
30.
Battles exactly, that he participated in. And again, the whole reason for these battles was not because he was defending himself or Muslims. He was basically, you're an infidel, you're a kafir, you're a non-Muslim, you're our enemy, because that's what he preached and he said Allah told him, and that's what the Quran says. And it was basically a caravan raid. They'd go and he'd butcher everyone and plunder them and steal their goods, and that's how he became, empowered himself. And so the idea of appropriating and stealing money from the infidel, that's as kosher as it gets when it comes to Islam. The fellow you mentioned in England, Anjem Chowdhury, as one example, I had a video of him saying, the jizya, which is non-Muslims who live under Islamic rule, have to pay tribute so they don't get killed, especially people of the book. And he said that he was getting all this governmental aid in the UK because it was a form of jizya. And he's like, of course, they're paying me. I'm the Muslim overlord and they're the slave. So it's only right for us to take governmental, aid. And he was stealing it too. In other words, he was apparently lying and saying, I don't know, he had more kids than he didn't, whatever. So the idea of plundering and robbing the infidel goes straight to Muhammad as well, because that's how he empowered himself and his followers. And that's how, if we can talk about that, all the initial caliphates and sultanates, that's what they were all about, just appropriating other people's wealth, including their bodies, as slaves, because Islam is by far the greatest slave master of world history.
Yeah. And again, so going back to that beginning, I never really put a knot on this one or put a bow on it. But okay, so Muhammad's out there for 10 years, trying, doesn't have a great following. And then this doctrine comes where it's like, wait a minute, we can evangelize by the sword, we can subjugate by the sword. And a lot of us followers were like, wait a minute, and that's where you even see the verses in the book, and just correct me on all this, but you even see the verses in the book where he's like, look, you may not like this, I understand, but this is the command of Allah. This isn't me, this is the command of Allah, that we must use the sword, we must bring everything under the command of Allah. And then, so when he then had this doctrine where it's like, you can go take, and it doesn't all come to me. They can raid and they get women, they get money, they can steal gold, homes, etc. All that was a doctrine that came up after 10 years of a lot of work and no following. And then Islam explodes. Is that a correct reading?
That's absolutely right. 10 years of peaceful preaching brought nothing, 150 followers. Then once the modus operandi changed to, hey, we're going to preach by the sword, and by the way, you're going to get rich, you're going to get women and slaves and plunder, and if you die, you're going to get even more riches and more women.
Yes.
And it became a win-win. Then it snowballed, and the more he conquered, the more people joined the bandwagon, because that was the way to, that's the way to win and survive and get all the pleasures of this world and the hereafter.
Yeah. Okay. And by the way, everything you're saying, you can go back, and this is coming from the holy books. This is coming from the Quran and the Hadith.
This is the Quran, the Hadith, which is the recorded words and sayings of Muhammad, and also the Sirah, the biography, which one of the oldest. They're all old, the Hadith, but it comes out around the same time, 8th or 9th century, which is a very comprehensive. This is what Muslims themselves go to, the biography, which is very thick in Arabic. And that's the one, if you read it, the author's name is escaping my mind right now, but I have it right here. And anyway, that's, if you read it, where you just, it's so, you can read right between the lines, and there's the hagiography is not, it's there, but it's, you can see right through it. And all you were reading about is a guy who was disenfranchised, and then he became powerful, and then he just went full-blown jihad, war on everyone, and became richer and stronger and more powerful. It's very, very obvious.
Yeah. And then
and this is why, just to add to that, from the very start, when Christians, and we'll talk about that, criticized Islam, they got it entirely from Islamic books that were accessible to them. And the very first Christians were those who could read Arabic, like John of Damascus and so forth. And they read these, and they were like, what are you talking about? I mean, this is just a bandit, who was killing people. And one of the very even earliest accounts is of a Jewish scribe who's asked about, have you heard of the prophet who's coming from Arabia? And this is maybe a year or two after Muhammad's death, or 5 years or so. And his response is, don't believe such tales, for prophets don't come on war horses and chariots and kill and murder. Okay, and so it was very obvious from the very get-go, from the start.
Yeah.
But to those who joined the bandwagon, they had to keep the narrative. We're not doing this because we're a bunch of bloodthirsty murderers. We're doing this because we're following God.
Yeah.
That's they need to wear the mantle of righteousness to justify themselves, and
Yeah.
that's been going on for centuries.
Raymond, is going back to that conversation, that very long conversation that I have recorded with Anjem Chowdhury. My favorite part was, so first of all, he came ready to battle, because that's what he had to do all the time right now. I mean, in his life, he's battling theologically all the time with people. And here I come along and I say, look, I'm like you, I'm a fundamentalist. So I understand you and I respect you, because you will speak and you source what you're saying, and you have principles that you stand on, and you're courageous. So I really like it. And he almost didn't know what to do. We had the most fascinating conversation because his guard came down.
Oh.
So, but then at the end, I said, listen, Anjem, I just want to kind of get into this before we leave. And I said, there have been many false prophets. Why do you follow Muhammad? You've obviously invested everything. You've invested your life and your eternity in this man. And yet, if you look at him, he was very different than any other prophet or perceived religious leader, because of the violence, which I'm not calling him violent. It's just, you look in the books, he was violent. So what, that opened up a fascinating conversation, and we started having some connection problems. So I had to call him back a few times in this conversation. But there's no badgering. It was all done in love. I really just had a heart for the guy, and it was fascinating. But all that to say that this is from the holy books. He was very different, as you said. What other religious leader comes on a war horse? And we'll jump ahead. We're not going to jump ahead in the interview, but just to that point of Islam is different. It's not just a religion, because it's a political system. It's theology, it's political, it's tribal, it's extended family, it's control of all your life, it's everything. So it's so different, trying to talk to the person who's not well versed and trying to understand Islam, because they just view it through a normal lens. And to the point too that, look, many Muslims, they don't understand who Muhammad was, and they're taught that he's like Jesus, right? And so if you open the Bible, there's not a big disconnect. But so many of them believe that, and it's so hard to really turn their mind, because it's like, this is his man, this man is perfect, he's the prophet, everything he did is perfect. Well then, okay, let's look at this instance. What happened here? What did he do with that woman there, those women? And it's such a weird disconnect. You've run into that, I'm sure.
No, I know exactly what you're talking about. It is a weird disconnect, because on the one hand, you're right. So many Muslims who are otherwise good people don't know their own scriptures. They don't know about the violence and the bloodshed and the jihad, especially if they're in the West or influenced by the West, because they, like Westerners, think all religions are the same and they're good, and they just preach love and tolerance, and they sort of conflate Christianity with it. But then, like you say, when you bring these up, two things can happen. One is, if they're critical thinkers, and they're being honest with themselves, they'll eventually apostatize, even if it's just in their heart.
Yes.
The other thing is, either out of stubbornness or because of tribalness, this is my religion, or because they actually because they themselves have criminal inclinations, and they start liking what they're hearing, which is, oh yeah, you can have sex slaves and concubines. Oh yeah, you can rob someone if he's of the wrong faith. Then they start liking it and just agree with it. Well, that's what it says. That's how we have to be. So you definitely have different categories of what they do with that information once it's made available to them.
Yeah, fascinating. I remember a conversation with an Egyptian in Egypt, and he was former radical. And he wasn't born as a radical. He got more and more radical before his conversion to Christ. And he said, looking back, he said, I realized, this is just what you said. He said, I realized the longer and the deeper I went into Islam, the worse the person I was becoming. Because then he started to understand really the bones, the structure of this religion and what they were really called to do. And you either have to buy in or you apostatize, like you said, and so many do. Or like, look at what happened with ISIS. After ISIS, and their brutality became so well known, and all done in the name of Islam. So many said either it's a bunch of religion is a bunch of crap, and I'm done with all of it. It's all bogus. And many others went to Christianity. They saw Jesus, and they're like, my gosh, that's the antidote. That's who I thought Muhammad was, but he's the antidote to that. So I don't know if you have any comment on that.
No, what you were saying, I'm very well aware of. Especially because I watch Arabic, satellite and internet, and they're constantly having these debates. And I know so many Muslims who've apostatized and become Christian, and also, like you said, those who just become secular or atheists. And this is something that's raging often in the Muslim world, and this is why why these laws like apostasy and blasphemy are so fundamental to Islam, because without them, Islam would cease to be. And while you were speaking, the idea came to me, which is interesting, is to a secular Western person, let's say, they will, with a broad brush, say you, for example, as a Christian and a radical Muslim are both fundamentalists, okay, which we can say is true. You go to the fundamentals, you go to the Bible, they go to the Quran,
book, yeah.
But the irony is, what they don't take into consideration, because they just kind of lump all religions together, is that even though you're both fundamentalists, you are diametrically different, because the books are diametrically different.
Absolutely.
Okay, the Bible, the New Testament's preaching tolerance and forgiveness and brotherly love and altruism, and then you have the Quran preaching violence and intolerance and subjugation and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And so it's funny, because the more pious a Christian becomes and the more pious a Muslim becomes, the diametrically opposed they become. They go. And so this is why it's also important to, be cognizant of this sort of divide when one uses words like fanatic or fundamentalist.